minister in Detroit Temple Number 1. This is where the nation is headquartered. Malcolm X, despite the interesting ways he's been historicized, one cannot deny the fact that he's an incredibly charismatic speaker, a powerful speaker. Elijah Muhammad recognizes this and very quickly sends Malcolm X to Harlem and establishes him as the minister of the Harlem Temple. And although it's not the headquarters of the Nation of Islam, because it's in Harlem and sort of black Manhattan, it very quickly becomes the most important temple. And Elijah Muhammad asks Malcolm X to be the national spokesman for the Nation of Islam. So very quickly, Malcolm X goes from jail to meeting Elijah Muhammad, to becoming assistant minister in the Detroit Temple, to becoming the head of the Harlem Temple, becoming the spokesman for the Nation of Islam, although he's not the head of the Nation of Islam. Under Malcolm X's charismatic leadership, the Nation of Islam grows exponentially. It's really very small in the 1950s. It grows from several hundred followers to over 10,000 by the early 1960s. Still rather small, of course. As Malcolm X continues to speak and advocate, the membership grows and new temples are established, radio stations are purchased, stores are opened up. The Nation of Islam in the early 1960s, late 50s, early 60s, is tapping into a growing disaffection within black America, particularly urban and northern black America. This is a movement that is overwhelmingly northern at this point in time. The Steel Belt, thinking along the northern Middle West of the United States, Ohio and Pittsburgh, heading across to Michigan, is becoming the Rust Belt, going through a period of deindustrialization. The jobs that caused blacks to migrate north after the Second World War are going away, and they're stuck in crumbling ghettos. And the rhetorical flair of Martin Luther King's speeches, this is also the period of King's greatest triumphs, aren't doing anything to change the daily quality of life for most blacks, particularly those living outside of the South. So if you're stuck in a slum apartment in Detroit, Michigan, Chicago, Illinois, the powerful rhetoric that's coming from King and the struggles in Birmingham, Montgomery, and other places, they aren't putting food on your table. They aren't changing what happens when you look for a job. Malcolm X's rhetoric isn't necessarily putting food on the table, but when you marry the rhetoric with the establishment of these temples and stores, Nation of Islam stores, and laundries, if you think back to Marcus Garvey's UNIA, black-owned entrepreneurial opportunities serving a black community, that's what the Nation of Islam is doing as well. If you tap into, if you are listening to Malcolm X's rhetoric and actually going to a temple, then maybe going to a store, you're finding yourself in a community that will help you. So Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam are tapping into something that's sort of festering. Disillusioned urban slum dwellers. There's growing skepticism in black America about the worth of integrating into the white mainstream. James Baldwin famously saying, "Why would I want to integrate into a burning house?" There is a growing increase in support for violent methods to solve problems, and a surge in nationalist sentiment among African Americans, not seen since the Garvey years, since the height of the Garvey movement in the 19-teens and in the 1920s. All of these things working together are increasing the numbers of the Nation of Islam, developing a broader support base. Now, the Nation is a religious organization and was steadfast in its refusal to get involved in contemporary electoral politics. Very different from Southern Christian Leadership Conference, for example, or SNCC, other organizations. The Nation is a religious organization. Had a very conservative social view, very much along the lines of Booker T. Washington's notions of self-help. It is racially separatist. It's not embracing any of the integrating logics of SNCC at that point, or NAACP or other groups. Malcolm X, in fact, had represented Elijah Muhammad and the Nation in negotiations with the national heads of the KKK and the American Nazi Party. Thinking back to Marcus Garvey believing that the head of the Klan was the most honest white man in America, he had the same kind of mentality being expressed in the Nation of Islam. But all was not well with the Nation of Islam either. There are whisperings as we get into the early 1960s about Elijah Muhammad and the allegations having affairs with teenage members of the Nation. Whisperings, he's actually impregnated several members of the Nation, and then publicly rebuked the same young woman for fornication, never naming himself in the process, and getting them thrown out of the Nation. There have been whisperings for a long time about financial improprieties. And there's an increasing sense of frustration, certainly felt by Malcolm X, but also by other members of the Nation, that coming down from Elijah Muhammad is a steadfast refusal to get involved in the politics of the day. And there's also a tension created by the fact that Malcolm X is increasingly popular. And although he's not the leader of the Nation, because he is the spokesperson for the Nation, he is seen as embodying the Nation. So we're in 1963. John F. Kennedy's assassinated in November. And Malcolm X, because he is such a prominent individual in the Nation, was asked what he thought about this moment of great national tragedy, and white and black Americans are devastated. The seeming prince of a person had been cut down. And Malcolm X very famously says, it was merely a case of the chickens coming home to roost. It's a response that Malcolm X meant to use to highlight the fact that JFK lived by the sword, and he was quite a saber rattler as a president, that he lived by the sword and therefore he was going to die by it. Now, whether Malcolm X's comment made any sense or not, it was a comment that horrified the country. Elijah Muhammad saw this as an opportunity, as it turns out. He is getting feedback, whisperings as well, that Malcolm X is becoming too popular, that Malcolm X is growing away from the Nation and from Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad is concerned about his ability to control Malcolm X. So Muhammad jumps on this opportunity and silences Malcolm X for 90 days based on that comment. He was not allowed to represent the Nation of Islam and not to speak on the nation's behalf. Now, from a standpoint of public policy, it made perfect sense. I mean, this is such a moment of anger focused on the Nation of Islam that to have done anything less than silence Malcolm X would have been seen as to, supporting this notion that the chicken's coming home to roost. But the truth really does lie elsewhere in terms of Elijah Muhammad's growing anxiety about Malcolm X and his popularity, and also because Malcolm X had confronted Muhammad about his affairs. that he had heard that these things were happening, was waiting for Elijah Muhammad to refute them. He never could. Financial improprieties, he couldn't refute those either. During this moratorium, this 90-day silence, it becomes clear to Malcolm X that his silence, his ban on public speaking would not be lifted. And so he breaks from the Nation of Islam. His speech, Message to the Grassroots, which I spoke from at the beginning of the lecture, is one of the last speeches he gives before he breaks from the nation. And if you look back at it, you see sort of the handwriting being on the wall, because peppered throughout Malcolm X's declarations would be, you know, that he speaks on behalf of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. As the Honorable Elijah Muhammad says, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad believes this, that, and the other. He can't say it in this speech. He's growing apart. So the split becomes official in March of 1964. Malcolm X establishes a religious organization called the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and a political organization called the Organization of Afro-American Unity, thus reflecting or creating this two-headed, or maybe these two organizations on separate paths, certainly embodying a belief by Malcolm X that broad social engagement provided blacks the best chance for ending racism. Not just a set of personal belief systems, but also engaging sort of the battle on the ground. This is the political aspect of the OAAU, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, that Malcolm X felt was lost, or that lost opportunity for the Nation of Islam. Before establishing the OAAU, Malcolm X makes a Hajj, a religious journey to Mecca. And during that trip has a stunning change of heart on race relations. Very famously in the autobiography of Malcolm X, written by Alex Haley, see Malcolm X talking about meeting Muslims who were whiter than the whitest person he'd seen in the United States, blue eyes and blonde hair. He had a very sort of immature notion of what traditional Muslim, Islamic faith was like, and what Muslims would, quote, look like even. So whites are no longer the blue-eyed devil in Malcolm X's view. His outlook, his political, religious, and ethical outlook, which certainly is revolutionary while he's with the Nation of Islam, becomes increasingly anti-capitalist. And this is something we're going to see not just in Malcolm X's belief system, but in other leaders' belief systems as we head into the mid and to late 1960s. Anti-capitalist thinking and rhetoric becomes much more important, and is certainly a string that ties a lot of these individuals together, although that linkage is often not talked about. He rejects his prior views on race. He rejects the idea of black separatism. He rejects his anti-Semitism. He rejects his opposition to intermarriage. All of these are views that he espoused while in the Nation of Islam. He comes to recognize that women actually did have an important role to play in the political struggle. And he begins to accept the idea of and look for alliances of black organizations with other groups committed to revolutionary